Okay, good to be here, guys. So yeah, I'm from North Carolina. I work at the manufacturing facility in Thomasville, North Carolina. That's where we're making all the laminate flooring that's sold in the North American market, pretty much. So when you install stuff, we made it. Hopefully you're pretty happy with the product. Like Mark said, we're going to talk about perimeter sealing a little bit. So the waterproof features of the product on the floor itself, around the perimeter of every plank, it has a special waterproof treatment, right? That's what's going to help. That plus the tight joint, the Uniclick joint that holds itself together really tightly. You know, when you're installing, hopefully you're feeling those planks snap together as you go. I love it when I feel that pop when I'm putting the planks together, because that means they're snapping together really tight. That tight fit plus the treatment around the perimeter of the plank work together to create a watertight surface, okay? So that's the surface of the floor. But the problem is, what about the perimeter of the floor? What if I have a spill or something and it tries to go up in the perimeter? As I'm sure you know, if any kind of water or liquid gets under the floor, it's gonna be a problem, right? So what's in the middle of our laminate floor? It's a high density fiberboard core. So it's very high quality, and it's got very low swell properties. It's got good properties for water resistance, but nevertheless, if the moisture gets into that fiberboard core, that's what we have to prevent, because that's where you're gonna have a problem, okay? So we're gonna talk about perimeter sealing a little bit. This is the kit that Mohawk sells for perimeter sealing. And it's basically the same items, you know, that you can get from Home Depot, but it's all in one nice little kit. You got your backer rod, you got your silicone caulk. Now silicone, it's important that you use silicone instead of some other kind of caulk, because it has to remain flexible, okay? One of the things, and we'll touch on a few different things as we talk about the perimeter sealing, but one key piece of information about this type of floor is it's a floating floor, right? When you do your installation, you're never attaching it to the subfloor. You're never gonna screw it down. You're never gonna glue it down. You're never gonna nail it down. It has to be free to move and float. So when we seal the perimeter, we have to make sure that the floor is still free to expand and contract a little bit over time, right? What's gonna make this floor expand and contract is humidity. When the humidity goes up, this floor wants to expand just a little bit. When the humidity goes down, it wants to contract a little bit. So we have to account for that. So the silicone caulk should remain nice and pliable and flexible over time. So you don't want to use something else that's going to turn brittle or whatever, okay? Now, the other thing is, somebody was telling me earlier, most of the time when you guys go in to do an installation, the baseboards are elevated. Is that right? There's like a ½ inch between the bottom of the baseboard and the subfloor, okay? That's actually a good thing. That makes the perimeter sealing a little different, but overall that's good. Out east, where I'm from, normally when the guys go in to do an installation, the baseboards are all the way down on the subfloor. Now, the problem with that, or the reason I don't like that, is because when the baseboard is all the way down on the subfloor, like here, and feel free to move around if you need to get a better view, but on this side of the room, we've got the baseboard flush with the subfloor. So that means that we have to leave an expansion gap between the edge of the floor and the baseboard, right? How big of an expansion gap do you try to leave? 3/8 is what the rule is, right? I actually recommend, you know, depending on the climate, so in the southeast where I'm from, we deal with extremely high humidity in the summertime, right? So I tell guys, leave a little more than that if you can, because you're gonna wanna try to account for the movement that's gonna take place over time. Here in this area, you may not have that issue, the humidity. I know we're in the Great Lakes region, so maybe you have a lot of humidity in the summer? You may have the same problem. So the floor is going to want to expand and contract a little bit. So 3/8 of an inch, that's your normal expansion gap. If you have let's say a long span, like if I'm dealing with a hallway that goes from here to that van, I may want to leave a little more room at the end, you know, to allow for more expansion and contraction. That's a little exaggerated. That would be a long hallway, but you know what I mean. When you've got a long span, typically we talk about 40-foot spans kind of being the max, but I know in some cases you may go higher than that, 50 feet. Something like that. So you want to leave more room. So let's do some sealing now. In this case, when you've got your 3/8 inch expansion gap, the baseboard all the way to the floor, we're going to put the backer rod into the gap, and then we're just going to run a bead of silicone right on top of that, smooth it out, and we're pretty much done. Then you put your quarter round over that. The biggest problem I find is the silicone residue that gets on the decor surface that I have to wipe up. So you just have to be careful not to smear too much onto the floor to minimize the amount of cleaning you have to do. So what do you do if you get some silicone on the decor surface? If it's still wet, it comes off pretty easily with a little bit of acetone. So if you keep a little bottle of acetone with you to just dampen the rag and clean that off, but you shouldn't have to if you're just kind of nice and careful and take it slow and easy when you're putting the silicone down. Does that all make sense so far? Okay. Now, what's the purpose of the backer rod? Again, without the backer rod, I've got to fill the whole gap with this, right? So I'm going to be using a ton of caulk, and if I fill it with this, when the silicone hardens, it's flexible, but it's kind of like hard rubber, right? So if I've got a block of silicone in that expansion gap, the floor can't move. It won't be able to move. The silicone will give a little bit, but not enough. So you want to have that backer rod in there so that when we put the silicone in, the silicone is just kind of forming a bridge over the backer rod, just like a flexible layer that can move in and out with the floor. Okay? Good? So, backer rod. That's good. All right. Nice thing about it is it just tears off really easily. All right, so I've got the backer rod in there. Now, before we seal it, I just want to mention a few other things. I'm just going to throw out a few things that we see common issues as we go around and look at installations. I get called on occasionally to go to a neighborhood where they've had problems maybe with the floor buckling or planks pulling apart as it tries to shrink a little bit. Some of the issues we see are you got to be sure that you've got that correct expansion gap all the way around, right? If you miss just one little spot, that's all it takes to create a problem later on when it wants to expand. Let's say, for example, this looks fine, but let's say along this edge, so the planks are running this way. So along this edge, if I'm a little sloppy, maybe it's late in the day, I'm tired, I know how we get, I start to pay a little less attention, and maybe I've got one plank that's sticking out farther than the others. So I've got a good 3/8 inch or 1/2 inch expansion gap all the way down, but I've got one spot where it's been reduced to a 1/4 inch or something like that because a plank is sticking out. Later on, if the humidity's high and that floor wants to expand, that one plank that I left too long can create a problem. As that floor expands, if anything hits somewhere, any planks hit the baseboard or the 2x4s underneath, bottom of the wall, the base plate of the wall, something's got to give. So as the floor tries to expand, if it hits something, it's going to buckle somewhere in the middle, right? Have you guys ever seen a floor that's buckled a little bit? You run into that? Okay. So those are some of the issues that we see, are uneven edges along there. Another thing we see sometimes is, and I see it on this installation here, guys will install the planks, but they don't trim the profile off of the plank that's up against the wall. Remember, you want to leave as much room as possible between the edge of the floor and whatever it's going to hit, the baseboard, the 2x4, whatever. So if you stand up in a little bit and look over here, you'll see that the tongue is still on the plank here. So normally we would want to trim that off with a table saw or a knife and have a nice square edge on those planks going up against the floor. Now, when it's the tongue like this, it's not a huge problem because the tongue is pretty narrow. If this were the groove side and we had the groove sticking out over here, well, that groove is eating up half of or most of your expansion gap, right? Remember, that groove is gonna, that piece sticking out, it's gonna hit the wall just as easily as the tongue will. So you always want to trim that off so you have a nice square edge. you want the decor, the pretty picture surface of the plank, you want that to be at the extreme edge of the floor, not the ugly HDF profile part. Does that make sense? So always, I know it takes a little extra time to do that, but the overall installation will be a much better quality if you're in the habit of trimming off that excess profile around the edge. Okay? So things like that. Now when I'm doing a perimeter sealing, I'll normally trim off the caulk tube a little bit bigger hole than I normally would for other stuff, because you have to lay down a pretty good chunk of caulk to cover that span, and so it's just a little bit easier. Oh yeah. So I'm just laying a big glob of caulk down along here. I'm going to stop right there temporarily. Let's see how neat and clean I can make this. Normally I'll just use a scrap piece of plank. So I'm already glopping it on the floor a little bit. Gets all over your hands. So you just want to make sure so I got a few spots that left kind of a gap. I'm just going to plug a little bit more in there. Is there another one of these? Okay, I don't think we have any acetone here, and that's okay, but you just want to kind of clean it up. Okay, you guys probably do it neater than I just did, but everybody agree with what I did there, or have any questions about how you do it differently? So that's case number one. The baseboard is all the way down on the floor. Backer rod, silicone, backer rod is critical, and then smooth it out. Then we can put our quarter round right on top of that, okay? You don't have to do any special sealing with the quarter round. We've already sealed the perimeter of the floor, so now all you have to do is a normal quarter round installation. Just sit it down there and nail it in, okay? Now, what about the other case where the baseboard is elevated like we have over here? Now, one thing that would usually be a little different here, so baseboard, let's talk about baseboards being elevated just for a sec. The reason I like the baseboard being elevated is because now we have more room for the floor to go under something. We not only have the quarter round molding covering the floor, but the base molding provides us some coverage as well. So I can run my installation all the way up to the base molding itself. I don't have to leave a 3/8 inch gap. Now, everything I said just now is true only if the baseboard really is elevated to the right height, right? You got to make sure before you do your installation that the baseboard is properly elevated all the way around. So what we recommend people do is just take a scrap piece of floor and a piece of pad, make sure you're accounting for the pad, and just go around and check. Just make sure that pad and floor piece are going to slide under the baseboard all the way around. I went to a buckling problem about 10 minutes from my house, actually, a new neighborhood. They were having issues with buckling. And as we went around the perimeter of the house, what we discovered was they had intended to install the baseboard a ½ inch off the floor so that this 8mm product could easily slide under it. But there were several locations around the perimeter where the baseboard was slightly too low. Now, what happens when the guys go in and install the baseboards? You guys don't normally do the baseboards yourselves, do you? Is that usually there when you get there, right? Okay. So what happens is when the guys do the baseboard, they've got their tricks, you know, just like you do for floor installations. They'll take their baseboard, they'll stick it in there, and they might have a couple of ½ inch blocks or shims or something that they put under each end, and the baseboard's sitting there. But what if it's sagging a little bit in the middle, right? If they're in a hurry, you know, they could easily have spots, or maybe they did a good job and everything's fine, but the subfloor is bulging in different spots, right? So anywhere around that perimeter where you've got less than a ½ inch between the bottom of the baseboard and the subfloor, that's a potential spot where the edge of the floor is going to hit it when it wants to expand in high humidity in the summertime and hit that, okay? So you always want to check that. Now what if you find a spot where the baseboard is too low, where it's not going to fit in there? Well, you can take a jam saw or something like that, your multi-tool, and trim that off. Now, you don't want to go around the perimeter of an entire house doing that kind of thing. I know that's very time consuming. So, you know, it's good to be in contact with the guys that are doing the trim work to make sure that they are installing it properly. Give that feedback to them if you run into problems. If the baseboard, no, the other thing, I keep saying ½ inch, right? ½ inch is good for 8mm product and 10mm product. It may need to be slightly higher than that for 12mm product, which I understand is most of what you guys do, right? So an inch is about 25 millimeters. So a 12mm product is already pretty close to a ½ inch. Then you put pad underneath it, right? And you account for some irregularities. So for 12mm product, in order to have what I'm talking about work out, that baseboard is going to have to be a little more than a ½ inch off the floor, okay? Now, what we got here in this little test installation, normally when your baseboard is elevated, we would do the installation so that the edge of the floor comes right up next to the baseboard, and then it can move when it wants to expand under the baseboard. We don't have to leave that big gap. That way we put our quarter round on. Now we've got the edge of the floor snugly concealed underneath the baseboard plus the quarter round, right? It's all about your molding coverage and the edge of the floor. I've been in some installations. I was out in Utah 2 years ago. They had the opposite problem. I'm from Utah, and Utah is the desert, right? So low humidity. So they had a problem where floors were shrinking a little bit and peeking out from underneath the molding. The problem was that when they did their installation, the edge of the floor was just barely underneath the molding, so they weren't accounting for the fact that it's going to want to shrink a little bit, right? So you have to have your installation and the molding set up so that as that floor moves a little bit, it stays concealed under the molding, but doesn't hit anything on the other side. Does that all make sense? Molding, the edge of the floor, even edges, all that kind of stuff. So I've never actually done this before, so we'll try it here. But I was consulting with the real installation expert with Mohawk. I'm kind of the sub-installation expert. Guy named Sandon. So he's done this a ton of times. And when you've got this situation where the baseboard is elevated, we were talking earlier, the problem you run into, if I tried to do that with the backer rod and the caulking, and I've seen this happen before, I run my bead of caulk along there, and because now the backer rod is going up underneath the baseboard, the caulk just kind of falls into the gap, and it's just kind of a mess, and it's hard to get a good seal there, right? You don't have to seal that perimeter. What you can do instead is just run a bead of caulk along the edge of the quarter round, just a narrow, thin bead of caulk. Oh, I'm sorry. And then just put that down and let it adhere to the top of the floor, and then you go ahead and nail this in. Does that make sense? So now instead of the perimeter sealing, we've got that soft, flexible silicone seal along the top of the quarter round, and then I put my quarter round down, and now it's on there. Then, now, what's going to happen when I put the caulk on and stick this down? Well, if I put too much caulk on, or even if I put on the right amount, it's going to want to ooze out a little bit, right? So this is where the cleanup, a little bit of acetone. One thing I'll caution about the acetone or isopropyl or whatever you use, don't squirt it directly on the floor. If you've got caulk that you need to clean up, like the little bit of mess I made here, don't take your squirt bottle and just start squirting it all over the floor, because that's going to affect, on a beveled edge product like this, that's going to affect the lacquer that we use to coat the edge. It might come off a little bit. So what you want to do is just dampen your towel and use that to wipe up the excess caulk, okay? Now, I'll be honest with you, and so I deal a lot with customer complaints, right? We don't have too many, thank goodness. But when we get complaints, if we have a problem with swelling, somebody says, hey, my pet peed on the floor, or I spilled a drink and I tried to clean it up, but the floor swelled a little bit. We don't get a lot of that, but it's almost always, in fact, it's always, in my experience, out in the middle of the floor somewhere, right? So the perimeter sealing, while it is important, normally the issues customers are having are out in the middle of the floor. So it's not very likely that what we're talking about is going to happen, but it could. Somebody, if you have a catastrophic problem like a toilet overflows, or a plumbing flood or something, you're going to have an issue no matter what we do with the sealing. So all we're trying to do is protect against more run-of-the-mill, oh my goodness, I spilled something, right? So the front edge is right there. I'm just going to get this going and smear it on here. All right, let's see if I can do this neatly. So I'm trying to keep it pretty small and thin. You do not need much. I'm going to stop there just in the interest of time. All right. I can already tell I'm going to have some cleanup to do. So you got to kind of carefully put it down. Oh, maybe not. That worked out surprisingly well. I thought I was going to have a lot of cleanup, stuff oozing out. All right. So you just want to make sure when it's all said and done that you're not leaving any silicone on the surface of the planks, because that's going to show up, as the lighting changes over time. Any questions so far? Earlier when I came in, this gentleman here was helping me. We noticed that, again, this is a test installation, and there were a few things about it that we wanted to fix. One of the things was, remember we talked about trimming off the profile? So the groove profile was still on these planks here in the doorway. So when we go to put this piece of molding on, we would have had to have put it very close to the edge of that profile, meaning there's no expansion gap. So we took a knife and trimmed it off. The good thing is the profile is typically pretty easy to trim off with a sharp knife, so that wasn't too big of a deal. Now we can put this down and leave the right amount of gap. So you guys are all familiar with the moldings. You guys use these moldings a lot, or? Yeah. Okay, so you're using shoe molding sometimes around the edge, but you're often using these transitions. This is pretty handy. As you know, we can trim it down to create different types of reductions, or you can turn this into a T-molding, or lots of different types of things. This can be used on the stairs in conjunction with a certain type of track. This comes with a plastic track that you're going to put on the floor. We've got 12 millimeter product here, right? So are you guys familiar with the track and the shims that are attached to it? I broke these off, but when you take this out of the box, you can just fold over these plastic pieces to create the right amount of height, right? You guys have all done this? Okay. So for this threshold here, we're going to want to, can I get one of you to help me and grab that drill And I think where'd we put here's our screws. You want to help me again? You want to help me again? Okay. Now the reason we wanted to put this this transition in was just to talk about the sealing around the transitions, okay? Basically the same as what you have around the rest of the perimeter. If the space is big enough, you can stick a piece of backer rod in there. If you're in a situation where the space is more narrow, then you do what we did with that cord around. You just run, all you need is a silicone seal along the edge of the floor. Whether it's in here, you know, sealing like that, or if it's just along the top. I find that it's easier in a case like this just to do what we did before and run that bead right along here and then snap it into place, okay?
Now the only thing is though, because we screwed them, you see how when the screw goes down and it closes the U-track up?
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to bend them up a little bit. So when you're putting that in, it won't get stuck in there, because once they get screwed down, they're down for good, you know what I mean? Because if not, if you got to pull it back up, they break, right? Every time. Every time you're done.
So what are you saying now? You
So
put this
see how-
on and you have to take it back out?
No, see how when you screw these in
Yeah.
and it closes it up, you
Yeah.
gotta open these up a little bit with like a hawk knife or something.
Oh.
Because if not, once these are down, once they're screwed down, because it closes it up,
It pinches it.
Are you saying once you snap this into place,
Yeah,
you won't be
that's
able to
it.
get it back out without
Yeah.
breaking it?
Without breaking it.
Yeah.
Because we screwed it.
And
Okay.
if you don't open those holes up, you're gonna get half the transition in. You're gonna get stopped.
Then it's not
You're gonna
gonna
try and
line
beat on
snap
it. It's gonna break.
Oh.
You're gonna have to replace all of it.
Exactly.
Okay. So how would you go about doing this then?
Just opening these up a little bit, you know?
Okay.
And that's really it. But you need a...
Get in there, twist it around.
Yep,
And that happens every time when you're
Every
using
single
these
time.
tracks
Every
like that?
single time,
Really?
man.
That's happened right
Okay.
there.
Okay, another piece of information for the molding guys. So the track closing up when you go to screw it down. Does it only happen when you're doing like a 12mm product where there's that thick shim underneath?
No.
So even if we had no
It's
shims,
just every plastic shim or every plastic U-track.
yeah.
Everyone.
So even if we had no shims, that U-track would want to close in when you put the screws in.
You get one shot at it.
Okay.
Yeah, you get one shot.
Yeah.
But we like having, it
The
would be nice
aluminum
if they
U-track.
were aluminum tracks.
So putting it makes it then one step more complicated when we talk about putting that bead of silicone on here.
Exactly. 'cause
And
if
now you
if
got
it
one
breaks
shot to
or
put it
something
in,
happens, then you're
and it gets a little messier.
Mhm.
So if that did happen on one, now if the planks are going this way, it'd be a little harder because you got silicone in the grooves
Yep.
between the planks. When they're going this way, it wouldn't be quite as big of a deal if you had to take this out and just wipe the silicone off and start over. But I see what you're saying. So that's another.
Besides that, it doesn't actually, if you seal that part there, like you're saying with the silicone, all right? Now you've got a bathroom that you're meeting up to.
Yeah.
It's got sheet vinyl straight down.
Yeah.
Now, water comes from the bathroom in this
Yeah.
way, you're not sealed.
The other part of this is, if you've got a situation like that, you want to run a bead of silicone to seal this to the
Now,
bottom.
What I've always done is before I put that track down, I just run my silicone up against that part.
That's
I've done
Seal
it.
and seal that.
that is okay. You can do that either way. Either way.
But
So
then
where we
it
put the
covers
foam
it
rope.
either way.
Yeah.
It's not gonna go under if it comes from
No,
here.
but
It's
you're-
not gonna go under if it
You're exactly right. We're trying to prevent liquid from getting on here and going this way,
Right.
but you also have to be concerned about whatever's on the other side of that. So you could either run your silicone just right along here and clean up, or do it before you put the track on,
Right.
or seal under the track, just whatever it takes to prevent that liquid from coming in the other side. Now we haven't run our silicone on here, but let's just try to
You
snap
want
it in.
you
So
want to put it in or just put it in?
just go ahead and put it in. Let's see how good we did at getting that track in the right spot. Okay, so that looks good, right? Let me ask you guys. So I don't know how much time we have left, so cut me off whenever we go too long. But what other questions do you have or concerns about the product in general? We've got several good things brought up about the molding. Okay, as far as the floor in general, do you find it clicks together pretty easily?
I love it, it's my favorite.
No issues with installation?